Claire Beaumont had never once in her 41 years asked a man to fix anything for her. Not a leaking faucet, not a flat tire on the 401 in January, not the furnace that quit on a Tuesday night in February when the temperature dropped to -28, and her daughter Isabel was 8 years old and asleep under every blanket in the house. She had fixed it herself. She fixed everything herself. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was architecture, the kind a person builds after enough things fall apart, and she had made hers so solid and so clean that no one got through it anymore. Not her board at Beaumont Capital, not her sister in Kelowna who called every Christmas with unsolicited opinions, and certainly not the quiet, unremarkable man her father had just installed in the carriage house at the back of her property in Westmount without so much as asking. His name was Garrett Ossie. He was 53 years old, recently widowed, and he had arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late September with a boy of 7 named Marcus tucked against his side and a canvas bag that looked like it had seen every province in the country at least twice. He wore a flannel shirt. He drove a truck that was 12 years old and had been maintained with the kind of attention that suggested a person who understood that things last longer when you take care of them properly. Claire stood at the kitchen window and watched him carry 2 boxes into the carriage house and thought that her father had lost his mind entirely. What would you do if the person you had dismissed as completely ordinary turned out to be the only one standing between you and everything you had worked for? Beaumont Capital managed approximately $280 million in private equity across Western Canada and had done so for 11 years under Claire's direction. She had built it from the small wealth management practice her father Alain had handed her in his semi-retirement and transformed it into something he still occasionally struggled to understand at the quarterly briefings, which she considered a reasonable measure of success. She wore dark blazers. She kept her calendar visible only to her assistant Fiona. She had not been to a dinner party in 3 years and did not miss them. Her father was 70 years old and lived in a stone house on the other side of Westmount with her mother and a golden retriever named Biscuit, and opinions about Claire's personal life that he expressed at every available opportunity. He was not wrong that she was isolated. He was wrong about what to do about it. When he had presented his case over Sunday roast in early September, Claire had listened with the patience of a woman who had heard a version of this argument many times before. He wanted her to have someone on the property, not a corporate security team, not a monitoring service. A single person, someone he trusted who would be present. There had been incidents, he said. A break-in at a colleague's home in NDG, a phishing attempt on Beaumont Capital's internal systems that bore the fingerprints of a specific kind of professional intrusion. A car registered to a numbered company with ties to a rival fund that had been seen parked outside her building on 3 separate occasions. Claire set down her fork. She explained that she had a monitored alarm system, a building staff who had all been background checked, and no interest in turning her home into a supervised installation. She was not afraid, and she was not going to act as though she were. Her father nodded. He did not argue further. He waited 6 days and then called in a favor from someone whose name he did not share with Claire and arranged for Garrett Ossie to arrive with his boy and his truck and his canvas bag and set up in the carriage house as the new property caretaker. The carriage house had been empty for 2 years since the previous caretaker retired. The position was legitimate. The arrangement was practical. It was also, Claire understood the moment she processed the logistics, nearly impossible to undo without triggering a clause in the property management agreement that her father had quietly revised 3 weeks earlier to require board-level sign-off on staffing changes. Her father had used her own paperwork against her. She stood in her kitchen and felt the specific, cold frustration of a woman who had been outmaneuvered by someone she loved. She went out to the carriage house at 5:15. The boy was sitting on the back step with a small wooden puzzle, working it with the methodical focus of a child who had learned to occupy himself. He looked up when she came through the gate and went very still. Not afraid, careful. There was a difference, and Claire, who had built a professional life on reading the distinction, registered it immediately. Garrett came to the door. He was not what she had expected, though she had not articulated to herself what she had expected. He was tall and broad-shouldered with gray at his temples and the unhurried way of moving that came from either great confidence or great fatigue or some particular combination of both that she did not yet have a name for. He met her eyes directly. He did not smile to manage the situation. She told him the rules. The carriage house was his. He did not come into the main house without being asked. He did not speak to her clients or colleagues about anything he observed on the property. He managed the grounds and the maintenance requests, and he sent her a weekly summary by text, not by knocking on the back door. She looked at the boy. He had gone back to the puzzle and was fitting a piece in without looking up. though she had the distinct impression he was listening to every word. "The child stays quiet," she said, not unkindly, practically. Garrett looked at her for a moment, then he said, "He always does." That was the first conversation. It lasted 4 minutes. She went back inside and told herself she had noticed nothing particular about him. This was not entirely true. The first week arranged itself around avoidance, which was easier said than done on a property where 2 buildings shared a courtyard and a gate. Claire left early and returned late. Garrett was always already awake when she went to her car in the morning, usually somewhere on the property with a coffee, not doing anything specifically purposeful, just present in the way of someone whose awareness was already on and functioning. He raked leaves from the back garden without being asked. He replaced a cracked stone on the garden path. He adjusted the exterior light fixture that had been angled incorrectly for 2 years in a way that she had not got around to fixing and that she had not mentioned to him. She did not thank him for any of it. She noted it. His son was named Marcus, and he was 7.5 years old, and had his father's dark eyes and the particular composure of a child who had been through something large and had come out the other side, still standing. He played by himself in the courtyard after school with a collection of small figures arranged in configurations that seemed to follow rules known only to him. He did not approach the main house. He did not ask for anything. He watched the back garden with those large, careful eyes and said very little. On the 4th day, Claire came home to find him in the courtyard, crouched over a section of the stone path, examining something on the ground with complete concentration. She stopped. She looked. There was a caterpillar making its way across the pale gray stone, and Marcus was watching it with the focused reverence that small children bring to things adults have stopped seeing. She stood in the gateway for a moment. Then she said, "It's a woolly bear. They turn into Isabella tiger moths in the spring." Marcus looked up. He looked at the caterpillar. He looked back at her. He said, "Does it know that?" Claire did not have an immediate answer to this question. She said probably not and went inside. She thought about it for the rest of the evening. The friction between Claire and Garrett was not hostile. It was the friction of 2 people who had each built careful, functioning lives around their own competence and were now obligated to share a courtyard without having agreed to. Garrett did not explain himself. He did not perform his usefulness or narrate his reasons. He simply did what needed doing and was present in a way that was, Claire had to admit, not intrusive, which made it harder to object to. She caught him one evening studying the exterior of the carriage house, with his arms crossed and his attention so specific and deliberate that she stopped to look at what he was looking at. There was nothing visible. She watched him trace something in the air with his eyes, some line of sight or angle she couldn't identify, and then he adjusted the position of the motion sensor light by exactly 3 inches. The next morning she noticed that the adjustment eliminated the shadow on the east side of the gate that she had always assumed was just an atmospheric feature of the property at night. She realized, standing there in the October morning with her coffee, that it had been a blind spot, a specific tactical blind spot, and he had found it without anyone pointing it out. She said nothing about it. She went to work. She thought about it for 20 minutes on the daiquiri. In her professional life, Claire was accustomed to reading people quickly and filing them correctly. Garrett resisted filing. He was not what a property caretaker looked like, not specifically, not in the way that mattered. The physical facts were right: the flannel shirt, the truck, the tool belt that appeared from somewhere when things needed fixing. But there were details that didn't fit. He read the terrain of any space he entered before he did anything else, exits and angles and positions, the way a specific kind of person reads rooms in specific kinds of situations. His hands were not just the hands of someone who worked with them. The patterning of the calluses was particular, and Claire had seen that particular pattern described once in a briefing document from a risk consultant who had done tactical fieldwork in very specific environments. She started paying attention in the directed way that she applied to things. He never raised his voice. He never hurried without cause. When she mentioned, without asking for input, that the back gate latch had been sticking, it was repaired before she got home that evening without discussion or invoice. When she returned from a client dinner in late October and he was standing at the edge of the courtyard in the dark, making no particular pretense of not watching the street, she pulled into the garage and sat in her car for a long moment before going inside. She did not ask him about it. There was a dinner at the Ritz in October, a private reception for limited partners. She allowed Garrett to drive her because Fiona had managed to double book the car service and the alternative was a taxi, and Claire disliked taxis for reasons she had never fully articulated. He drove the way he did everything else, without narration, without asking unnecessary questions, adapting to conditions. She was reading a partnership brief in the back seat when he turned off Sherbrooke without a word. She looked up. "That's not the way." "There's been a car behind us since Atwater," he said. "Same speed, maintaining distance. It will be gone by the time we make the block." He made the block. The car was not behind them when they came back onto Sherbrooke. He pulled up to the Ritz entrance and held the door and said nothing further about it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. She said, "You've done this before." He said, "Driven?" She looked at him. His face told her absolutely nothing she could use. She went inside. She could not pay full attention to the reception for the first time in years. Over the following week, she began building a file the way she built any file, systematically, from what could be verified outward to what could be inferred. He had listed 2 employers on the form her property manager had collected. Both were legitimate Canadian security firms. When she mapped their known contracts and operational histories, both had worked almost exclusively with clients requiring federal-level clearance. His reference contact at the second firm was a man who, when she ran his name through the Beaumont Capital Professional Network database, appeared in a single conference proceeding document from a joint industry-government security consultation. Not the public version of that document, the unredacted version that Beaumont Capital held access to through its government pension fund contracts. In the unredacted version, that man's name was listed as a liaison to a joint operations review committee. Claire sat with this for a long time. The employment gap in Garrett's file was 3 years long and produced nothing, no contracts, no addresses, no records of any kind. She had seen one other file with that particular shape, a defense contractor who had done work she had not been given details of, whose civilian identity had been partially constructed by people who built such things for operational reasons. She closed her laptop and sat in her home office at 11:30 at night and was very still. The incident happened on a Thursday. Her director of operations, a careful, meticulous man named Bernard Kellaway, flagged it at 8:40 in the morning. An access log showing a query on the limited partner database, the one containing the personal financial information of Beaumont Capital's 83 private clients, run on credentials belonging to a mid-level analyst named Andrew Tran. The query had run at 1:47 in the morning. Andrew Tran had not badged into the building that night. His access card had been used to leave at 6:12 the previous evening. Claire was in the operations room with Bernard and their external IT security contractor within 15 minutes of the notification. She did not raise her voice. She isolated the credentials, locked the affected segment, and directed Bernard to run a full access review of the past 90 days before anyone outside that room had been told what was happening. She was good in a crisis. She had always been good in a crisis. What she could not contain was the weight of the implication. If someone had Andrew's credentials and remote access to the system, they had either broken through the network perimeter or they had assistance from inside. Andrew Tran had been with Beaumont Capital for 2.5 years. His reviews were excellent. He had also had coffee twice in the past month with a man she had seen in the lobby once and placed in the general category of vendors without looking closely enough. She pulled security footage. She sent the image to her IT contractor and asked for an identification search. While she waited, she forwarded a copy to Garrett by text, more on instinct than strategy. His response came back in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The man's name, a corporate registration number, a firm called Frontier Analytics Advisory which had incorporated 16 months ago and which had 2 known principals, one of whom had worked for 7 years at a competing fund that had lost 2 major pension mandates to Beaumont Capital in the past 18 months. She stared at the response for a long time. She had not asked how he had that information. She did not ask. The rest of the day was contained chaos. By 7 in the evening, she had identified 4 additional unauthorized queries running on Andrew's credentials over the previous 6 weeks, all masked differently, all targeting the same subset of limited partner records. She had also identified that Andrew had refinanced his mortgage under financial pressure 4 months ago. Nothing in the HR system had flagged it because no one had thought to look. She left the office at 9:15. Garrett was in the courtyard. Marcus was inside. She could see the light off in the upper window of the carriage house. He was standing near the gate. She had not told him she would be late. He was there regardless. She walked past him. She was at her back door when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered because she was operating on adrenaline and reflex rather than judgment. The man's voice was level and deliberate and had the quality of someone who had practiced sounding calm the way other people practice sounding reasonable. He told her the query earlier in the week was a demonstration. He told her she had 48 hours to contact a number he would send. He told her the next step would involve her clients rather than just their data. She ended the call. Her hands did not shake. She turned around. Garrett was 4 feet away. He had crossed the courtyard in silence and was watching her face with the undivided, specific attention he used to watch the street. "Threat call," he said. It wasn't a question. She told him what had been said. He listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, a different quality of quiet than his usual reserve, the quality of someone processing toward a decision rather than simply waiting. "They're not negotiating," he said. "The 48 hours is theater. They're already in motion. You need to go inside now." "I need to make a call." "You need to," she said, Claire. It was the first time he had used her name without any of the professional distance that had characterized the previous 3 weeks. It stopped her the same way an unexpected sound stops a person. She heard the weight in it. She went inside. She sat in her kitchen and listened to the sound of the city and tried to feel like the person who ran a $280 million fund and was not afraid of anything. The attempt was only partially successful. At 1 in the morning she heard a sound from the courtyard that was not right, not loud. Wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when you have been in enough difficult situations to know the difference between the city's ordinary sounds and a sound that does not belong. She went to the edge of the window. There were 2 men at the gate. She registered that much before Garrett appeared from a position she had not known he was in, a shadow at the edge of the carriage house that had simply seemed like shadow. What happened in the next 30 seconds was not what she had expected from a man who fixed latches and raked leaves. The 2 men were on the ground and restrained before she had fully processed what she was watching, and the person doing it moved with a precision and economy that had no relationship to anything listed in his employment file. He stood up. He checked the street. He looked toward her window and gave one short nod. She stepped back from the glass. She had not been afraid of anything in a long time. Standing in her kitchen in the dark, she recognized that she was not afraid now either, which told her something about the specific nature of what Garrett Ozzie was that she had not yet found the right category for. She did not sleep. By the time the sky outside had shifted from black to the pale gray of a Montreal October morning, she had gone through his file 3 more times and built it differently each time. What read as sparse on the first pass read as shaped by the second. What read as shaped by the second read as deliberately constructed by the third. The 3 employment years that produced no records at all. The firm liaised with federal operations. The particular pattern of calluses she had misidentified initially and now recognized from a training assessment document she had read 18 months ago and not expected to need again. At 6:15 she heard him in the courtyard. She went outside. The air was cold. He looked at her face and knew she had not slept. She looked at his face and knew he had been awake also. "I know what a managed file looks like," she said. "I've built enough of them in a professional context to know the shape. Yours has that shape. The 3 years before your first listed employer don't exist, and I don't mean that the records are thin, I mean they don't exist. The liaison at your second firm connects to joint federal operations at a level that doesn't appear in standard corporate security." She paused. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I need to understand what is happening." He was quiet for a long time, not the quiet of someone building an evasion, the quiet of someone making a decision about how much truth the situation required. "I'm not going to give you a full accounting of my history," he said. "Not right now. But I will tell you that nothing you're dealing with is beyond what I've trained for, and your father knew exactly who he was hiring when he called in the favor." She felt the confirmation settle into place. Alan hadn't hired a caretaker from a listing site. He had found Garrett specifically, which meant he had known precisely who Garrett was before the conversation over Sunday roast, before the board paperwork revision, before any of it. "Why the cover?" she said. "Because the people coming after your fund aren't preparing for someone with my background on site. If they know what I am, they adjust. The cover isn't deception, it's operational." She processed this. She asked about the men from the night before. "Federal retrieval," he said. "By this afternoon I have contacts who will process it without exposure to you or the firm." Federal contacts, yes. She stood in the cold morning and recalibrated everything she had built about the situation over the previous 3 weeks. The man she had treated as an inconvenient imposition arranged by a meddling father had spent those 3 weeks keeping her and her firm intact without requiring her to know about it. "You could have told me," she said. There was no accusation in it. She was genuinely asking. "You would have pushed back," he said. "You would have run your own analysis and concluded the threat assessment was overstated and found a way to end the arrangement before you understood what you were dealing with. Your father was clear that the decision to keep me here had to be yours, made freely after you understood, not something engineered around you." She thought about her father, 70 years old, sitting across from her at Sunday roast, already knowing what she didn't, deciding that the most effective thing he could do for her was put the right person in her courtyard and trust her to figure it out. She thought about the 3 weeks she had spent treating Garrett as a problem to manage. "Tell me everything relevant to the frontier operation," she said. "Everything you've observed." We're working on this together from this point forward." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." It was the longest conversation they had ever had. The next 10 days ran differently. They mapped the Frontier operation together, Garrett providing intelligence from sources he named only obliquely, Claire providing the financial architecture, the pattern of the targeted records, the shape of what someone would want from Beaumont Capital's limited partner data and what they would do with it. It was efficient in a way that the previous 3 weeks had not been. They did not waste each other's time. She asked specific questions. He gave specific answers. They disagreed twice on probability assessments, and both times the disagreement produced a sharper conclusion than either position had started with. She also, during those 10 days, spoke with Marcus. The first time was an accident. She came into the kitchen at 8:30 in the evening for water and found him at the table with a glass of milk and his collection of small figures, rearranging them in a configuration she couldn't follow. He looked up and waited to see what the rules were. She filled her glass. She asked what the figures were doing. He considered this seriously. "They're trying to get across," he said. "Across what?" He thought about it. He said, "Just across." She looked at the arrangement on her kitchen table, the careful lines of small figures in transit, and she did not say anything further because there was nothing reductive enough for the moment. She went back to her desk. She thought about it for longer than she intended to. The second time, Marcus appeared at the door to her home office with something in his hand. It was a drawing on a piece of cardboard, carefully done, a building with many windows and a small figure standing in front of it. He held it out to her without explanation. She took it. She studied it with the seriousness it deserved. She said it was very good. He assessed her to see if she meant it. He determined that she did. The smile that arrived on his face was brief and total and changed the temperature of the room completely. She kept the drawing. She put it on the edge of her desk where she could see it from her chair. The third time Marcus asked her what she did in there all day. She said she managed money for people who needed it to grow. He thought about this. He said, "Like a keeper?" She said yes, something like that. He nodded and went back to the courtyard. She found, against all expectation, that the presence of the boy in her house in the evenings was not disruptive. His quietness was not absence. It was the quietness of a child fully inside his own interior world, and that world had a weight and a realness to it that she found, without deciding to, genuinely restful. On a Friday evening in early November, she brought home a proper set of artist's pencils from the Bag Art Shop on Sherbrooke and left them on the kitchen table without comment. Marcus found them the next morning. He sat with them for a long time before he touched them. When he finally opened the tin and looked at what was inside, he turned to look at Claire across the kitchen with an expression of such absolute unguarded wonder that she had to turn and look at the window for a moment. Garrett saw it. He was in the doorway. He said nothing about it. That evening he put a second mug of coffee on the counter near her workspace. Not asking, not explaining, just there. She drank it. The operation's endgame came on a Saturday. Frontier's principals had spent 2 weeks watching the situation deteriorate around them as quietly and systematically as a drain. The federal contacts Garrett had activated were moving. Claire's legal team had filed in Superior Court. The unauthorized access documentation, the credential theft, the intercepted communications with Andrew Tran, whose cooperation, once shown the full scope of what was coming, proved total and immediate, built a case that was not complicated to make once you had the architecture right. Victor Arnault, the primary principal at Frontier Analytics Advisory, did not go without a considerable amount of noise. He had lawyers in 3 firms and a prepared media position that he released through a communications firm on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the legal record had been made available to the relevant journalists, and the media position collapsed in a fairly unremarkable way. The civil filing alone would cost Frontier its institutional client eligibility for the foreseeable future. Andrew cooperated fully. He had been leveraged through the mortgage refinancing, an old and effective method, and Claire did not confuse coercion with complicity, though she did not confuse them with the same thing either. She ended his contract. She did not destroy him. She held a staff meeting when it was over. She stood in front of 42 people in the Beaumont Capital boardroom and said something she had not planned to say, something that arrived only in the moment of standing there, that the firm's technical security was strong and would be stronger after Bernard's review, but that she had made a structural error in the culture she had built. She had designed a firm where information moved vertically and trust moved nowhere, and that design had created exactly the kind of vulnerability a sophisticated operation needed. She was going to correct it. 42 people looked at her. Several looked surprised. Bernard Kellaway in the second row gave a single measured nod. She considered it a beginning. Her father came to the house the following Sunday. He arrived to find Marcus at the kitchen table with his artist pencils and Garrett at the counter making coffee and the drawing on the edge of Claire's desk. He took all of it in with an expression of careful neutrality that convinced no one. He shook Garrett's hand with the specific warmth of a man who has arranged something correctly and is very pleased to see it holding. Claire told her father over dinner that she forgave him for running the maneuver. She said it without irony. He smiled into his wineglass and did not look sorry. Garrett was not a permanent fixture, and both of them understood this without saying it. The frontier threat was resolved. The assignment was complete in the terms under which it had been structured. He was, at his foundation, a man who did not remain past the end of his purpose. Neither of them said this out loud. It was simply present in the way of real things which do not need to be announced. What was also present without announcement, without definition, and without either of them having the particular vocabulary for it yet, was something else. Claire had not asked for specifics about his wife. She had not needed to. Enough had been said in enough pieces over enough evenings in the courtyard that she had assembled the shape of it without requiring the whole. A woman who had worked alongside Garrett in the same line of work, who had died in what he called a workplace incident, which she understood to mean something that did not happen in offices. Marcus had been 14 months old. Garrett had handed in his credentials 6 weeks after and had not returned. He had become, for his son, the entire stable world, the grounds crew, the coffee maker. The man who read picture books at bedtime and drove the 12-year-old truck and lived in carriage houses and was always already awake when the morning came. She had spent 3 weeks treating that person as an inconvenience. The awareness of this sat with her, and she let it sit without trying to resolve it into something more comfortable. On one of the last evenings of October, she was in the courtyard with her coffee, after Marcus was in bed, and Garrett came out and sat on the bench at the other end, and neither of them said anything for a while. The city made its sound. The lights were on in the apartments above the lane. The air was cold in the specific clean way of a Montreal autumn before the snow comes and changes everything. "You gave up a great deal," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I got something I didn't know I needed, Marcus." "Yes." He paused. "And the chance to do work that means something without losing track of what work is supposed to mean." She thought about this. She thought about Beaumont Capital, built from her father's small practice and her own considerable refusal to fail, maintained through 7 years of deliberate isolation, running on the premise that closeness was exposure and exposure was liability. She thought about the drawing on her desk that she had not moved since Marcus left it there. She thought about the 42 people in her boardroom who had looked surprised when she said she was going to change something. "I built this firm on not letting people in," she said. "I know," he said. "That was probably a mistake." He looked at her steadily. "Probably," he agreed. She had the clear sense that he was not talking only about the firm. She did not address that directly. But she held his gaze for a moment before she looked away, which was, for Claire Beaumont, as close to an answer as she had ever given anyone who had not already earned it several times over. The days that followed were ordinary in the way that days become ordinary again after something has shifted in the underlying structure. Garrett was still in the carriage house. Marcus was still at the kitchen table with his pencils in the evenings. The truck was still in the lane. The gate latch still worked perfectly. The difference was the space that had opened up in how she moved through her own house. She brought home good coffee beans from the market on Monkland and left them on the counter without explanation. Garrett made the coffee. It was better. Marcus told her once, with great seriousness, that his father had been a soldier before, and she said she knew, and he thought about this, and said he's better at the table now, and she said yes, she thought so too. One afternoon in November she came home to find Marcus at the kitchen table with a drawing in progress, something with many small figures crossing what appeared to be a bridge, and she sat down across from him without being asked and watched him work for a while. He did not stop. He did not look up. He simply accepted the company the way children accept the presence of adults who have proven themselves worth the air. Garrett came in from the courtyard and saw them at the table and stood in the doorway for a moment before going to make the coffee. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The snow came in November the way it always did, without ceremony, just there one morning when you looked out the window. Marcus stood in the courtyard with his arms out and his face turned up and laughed at it, and the laugh was not the careful, composed expression she had come to associate with him. It was entirely unguarded and entirely 7 years old, and it filled the courtyard so completely that Claire, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, felt something in the architecture she had spent years constructing shift slightly on its foundation. Not collapse, shift, the way a structure shifts when it is finally being asked to hold the weight it was built for. She watched Marcus turn in circles in the snow and did not look away. Garrett came to stand beside her at the window. They stood there together in the kitchen with their coffee while the snow came down outside, and the boy laughed in it. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. The city moved around them. The snow kept coming. She was not afraid. She was not alone. She was not even sure anymore that she had ever been as alone as she had spent 11 years believing. She was simply a woman standing in her kitchen in the November snow, watching a child be joyful, and finding for the first time in longer than she could measure that this was not only enough. It was exactly what she had been building toward all along, without knowing that she was building toward it, without knowing that the thing she had been protecting all these years was not the firm, not the fund, not the portfolio of other people's futures. It was this, the possibility of standing still in an ordinary room and feeling no need whatsoever to manage what happened next.